Welcome back to the class. Today we are going to discuss uh, Marx on democracy and colonialism. And we know that given the breadth of Marxian writings and the depth of his scholarship, there's hardly anything that you can't have a Marxian interpretation on or a Marxian perspective on. But and because of the very reason that Marx has written so extensively on a wide variety of topics, the list of topics could be endless, where we can talk about a Marxian approach or a Marxian perspective on so and so issues. But two of the most important issues which are widely discussed as are Marxian take on, or whatever Marx's approaches or Marx's perception or Marxian position on some of the crucial issues like democracy and colonialism. Because the subsequent theoretical debates about democracy and colonialism has evolved over the last uh, century, and many of these debates have very critically analyzed Marx's own position about these two things: the democratic institution of principle of democracy and this historical episode of colonialism, and what was Marxian position, what were the Marxian insights onto that, and to what extent we can critically analyze or critically apprise of Marxian position on democracy and colonialism. Extremely controversial position. There have been voluminous writings on these topics, but it's important that we have some idea about that. Now, Marx on democracy. And the usual or the commonsensical understanding is that Marx never favored democracy because he was a communist, and communism and democracy are not, they don't go together. Communism is always associated with the dictatorship, and that has been the experience of the world for the past several decades. So the communist countries where the ideology of communism has become a state ideology, in those societies, democracy does not have any value. It's mostly run in an extremely dictatorial manner, and the case of Soviet Union, or the case of Cuba, or the case of China, or a host of other communist countries really stand testimony to that. And whether you say it was an aberration or it is not how communism is supposed to function, these arguments do not hold water, because what is more important for us is to understand how they empirically get realized. Okay? So one of the most important position that is often attributed to Marx is his very controversial remark that a post-capitalist society will be characterized by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay? So it's not, at least he did not present it as a democratic thing, but it was as a dictatorship of the proletariat. And this term dictatorship is an extremely problematic term. And we know that dictatorship by anybody can be problematic. Dictatorship, even by the most benevolent person or the most benevolent of the social groups, can be extremely problematic, because it fundamentally goes against some of the ideas of democracy. It goes against the devolution of power. It goes against a whole set of some of the very, very important central ideas of democracy. So, but the point here is that Marxian position is much more complicated or much more nuanced than this easy characterization that is often assumed on the basis of this argument, that he characterized the post-capitalist society as that of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marxian analysis of politics and democracy by placing them in the context of class struggle. The state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. It rules with the economic interests of the bourgeoisie in mind. And when you look at Marxian critique of democracy, you come across some of the most powerful criticisms against the idea as well as practice of democracy. Because most of the justifications for democracy, most of the celebrations of democracy come from a liberal understanding that every individual is an equal, independent individual bestowed with a set of rights, and democracy is a perfect system where each of these individuals is able to make use of his or her political right. And here comes a Marxian criticism. So the Marxian criticism is extremely critical, or it's extremely vehement on this argument that, or the assumption that in a modern system everybody is equal. The argument that the political equality does not make every person equal. Political equality is only one dimension, but far more important is the question of economic inequality. So there's a fundamental tension between Marxian understanding of equality and the liberal understanding of equality. So that is the main reason why Marxism is able to provide some of the most powerful critique of the way in which democracy is celebrated or liberalism is celebrated. So his analysis of politics, so Marxian analysis of politics and democracy is something very important because he is extremely skeptical of this whole idea of democracy without achieving a kind of an economic equality, and he's extremely critical of the state because state, he always keeps it at the superstructure, and he very firmly believed and then argued that the state by default, by design, by its structure will be bound to take care or to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie. And he establishes it with historical evidences and also through his analysis that the state cannot act in favor of the proletariat because state is an institution, and he uses this very, very, very interesting term. He says it as this executive committee of the bourgeoisie. I don't think that you can use a more demeaning term than that. It's an executive committee of the bourgeoisie. It rules with the economic interests of the bourgeoisie in mind. So Marx argues in theory, you can't have a modern nation state which is or which can be expected to be fair or which can expected to do justice to the cause of the proletariat or to that of the poor or to that of the have-nots. It is not possible. It is impossible as per Marxian argument. So Marx writes that the so-called rights of man are simply the rights of a member of civil society. That is, egoistic man, a man separated from other men and from other community. And this is the most profound criticism of the liberal perception of equality, where everybody is seen as individual, everybody is seen as disconnected from the society, everybody is seen as a person who is completely guided by self-interest, egoistic person, a person who has no commitment to the larger society, a person, as per Marxian discourse, is not aware about the historical role supposed to be played by him. Okay, a person who is only bothered about one's own life. And Marx is extremely critical of that idea of a man as a right-bearing individual in the civil society. Civil society is essentially the economic realm. For the anatomy of civil society is to be besought in the political economy. Okay? So, this whole theoretical debate about civil society is really fascinating. That itself is a different topic, the way in which the liberal idea of civil society emerged as a space between the individual and the state, a very important space. And of course, with the later theorization of scholars like Habermas, this idea of public sphere comes into picture. So public sphere and civil society are seen as some of the most important stepping stone for the flowering or the flourishing of democracy. And later, the Marxian critique of that, Marx almost dismisses the role of civil society. And later, Gramsci's intervention, and Gramsci almost reinterprets or provides a far nuanced analysis of civil society. He understands, he kind of recuperates civil society, he rescues civil society, reinvents civil society as an important space, for building this class consciousness. So that's an extremely interesting analysis in itself. But for Marx, civil society cannot be made sense of by only looking at its political realm. Essentially, it has to be understood at its economic realm. The anatomy of civil society is besought in the political economy. What is the structure of a civil society? What is its economic composition? Okay? How are different sections of people are structurally incorporated in that structure on the basis of economy? Who owns? Who gets to own? Who do not own? And what is the kind of a relationship between these? And this particular analysis is at the central of Marxian argument. So the real democracy is not based on constitutions or representative. Real democracy is not based on constitutions or representative institutions, for these can be discarded at any time. So Marx argues that the true democracy. The democracy in its true sense cannot be reduced to constitution or representative institution because it can be dismissed, it can be discarded at any time by a powerful coup. Rather, democracy means overcoming the dichotomy of public power embodied in the government and social power embodied in the civil society. Okay? So he talks about overcoming the dichotomy of public power embodied in the government. That is, on the one hand, you have the state which have all the political power, and in the civil society, you have the social power, which is defined by the kind of an economic inequality. So essentially, it means socialism, overcoming of the class inequality. So in Marxian analysis or Marxian prediction or Marxian projection, in a socialist society, you will have this kind of an equality in the realm of the government as well as that of the civil society. It's a state where class inequality is demolished, class inequality is completely obliterated, and that leads to a real sense of democracy where everybody has equal stakes both at the level of the state as well as that of the civil society. So he praised the short-lived Paris Commune of 1871, where direct rule of people was established for the true democratic era. So Marx was not in principle against the idea of democracy, but his understanding of democracy was much more radical. He was not ready to accept democracy only within the realm of political right without bringing in the question of economic inequality. And that is an extremely important point that we need to keep in mind. He believed in democracy, he believed in the rule of the people, by the people in the truest sense, in the most radical sense. Maybe you can say utopian sense. Marx thus advocated a decentralized form of participatory democracy that has many affinities with the anarchist rivals and the republican traditions of Aristotle through Rousseau. He supports a proletarian space, a public sphere where workers can develop qualities necessary to govern the society. Yeah. So he talks about a much more radical character of democracy where the state is actually run by the people. Again, the modalities of that, the practical difficulty is a completely different question. Okay, how does one do that? Can we live in a society where everybody can equally participate in the form of governance? So these kind of practical questions are not the immediate concerns of Marx, but he's concerned about the kind of a larger ideal of you having a system where you are able to everybody, especially the proletariat, is able to take part in the true sense of the meaning. So the true socialist democracy depends on social equality and collective participation rather than constitutional guarantees and representative institutions. So he's talking for a socialist democracy where the socialist revolution has taken place and a classless society is established, class inequalities are made to disappear, and that society, Marx would argue, is the most conducive society for the true sense of democracy. Drawing on the republican tradition, Marx argues that the freedom and community are interdependent. And freedom can only be realized in conditions where people control their activity. Marx recognizes the limits of purely political change that only alters laws without changing the social conditions of particular groups. People have to transform the social world themselves if change is to be effective at least. So this is the fundamental point. Unless you bring in fundamental substantial changes in the social structure, okay, where you make a more egalitarian society, where you don't have a system of haves and have-nots, where you don't have a system of a powerful group of few people controlling or amassing the vast amount of wealth, and the vast majority of the people are made to suffer. That society, for Marx, does not represent the spirit of democracy. It's a very, very powerful criticism. It's an extremely powerful criticism when you talk about crony capitalism, when you talk about the way in which democratic institutions in capitalist system have been distorted, have been made used by this industrial groups or the bourgeois Marx comes to mind, because he's the one who very profoundly argued to combine these two aspects. Now, let us have a brief look at Marxian take on colonialism. This is also something extremely controversial, because Marx lived um, during the time of colonialism, and Marx had written quite a lot of things about colonies, about the process of colonization. He has written extensively on India. He has a major thesis on this Asiatic mode of production as a separate one, and he criticizes India. He has a very low opinion on the intellectual, role of Indians. He thinks that the British invasion was something necessary, and he thinks that this was something came as a necessary shock for Indians. He considers it as positive. At the same time, he's also extremely critical of the exploitative aspects of colonialism. So it's just a more complicated thing than whether Marx was for colonialism or against. Marxian position is much more nuanced. So there is one thing is very clear, that his Eurocentric orientation is clearly evident in the discussion on colonialism. This Eurocentrism is a fact that is relevant in the realm of every intellectual, every scholar of Europe during the particular time. And even now when we talk about decolonization, even now when we try to take the philosophy of social theory beyond the realm of Eurocentrism, it's only partially successful. It's the Eurocentrism is something so inherently ingrained in the thinking, and Marx was no free from that. For Marx, Europe represented the model. Europe represented the true essence of humanity, and all other societies were seen as backward, and Europe was seen as leading the world. So this depiction of Asiatic mode of production as static, unchanging, lack of private property, unlike capitalism. So Marx argued that why that the Asian societies are not able to make progress is, as per Marxian argument, it is because of their mode of production, where he argued that it is very static, it is unchanging, there is no private property, it's all ruled by kings, and this particular economic structure, Marx argued, is not conducive for a larger change, unlike Europe, which has seen the kind of a larger transformation through capitalist revolution and then ultimately through a kind of a socialist revolution. So his analysis of Asiatic mode of production itself is quite controversial. It's very interesting. So according to Marx, non-Western people lack history. In his words, Indian society has no history at all, at least no known history. What we call it history is but the history of the successive intruders who founded their empires on the passive basis that unresisting and unchanging society. And we will find this statement as extremely offensive, isn't it? Because it actually presents a very distorted idea of what history means. But Marx wrote this idea. Okay? Marx wrote this idea because he had a very peculiar, distorted idea regarding what constitutes history. Otherwise, he wouldn't have no person who is sensitive today about Eurocentrism or about racism will write this kind of very blatant arguments that Indian society has no history, and whatever history Indian society has is only the history of intruders who are coming and conquering all these people, unresisting and unchanging society. It's blatantly incorrect. It is blatantly incorrect, historically incorrect, because if you look at the kind of engagement that India had with the rest of the societies through trade and through philosophical engagements, it's something immense. It's immense, and it was quite uncharitable for Marx to write this. So they cannot represent themselves; they must be represented. Another colonial trope, that every colonies, they cannot represent themselves, they do not know how to represent, they must be represented by a higher authority. Isn't it? A politically superior position which will not go down with anybody in the contemporary times. But Marx wrote that. So Marx's endorsement of European colonial expansion as a necessary step in the progress of the world and its advance towards socialism. So now, once we realize that Marx was Eurocentric, he was very uncharitable with the civilizations and societies outside the European realm. But his position towards colonialism is something more interesting. He says that Marx's endorsement of European colonial expansion as a necessary step in the progress of the world and its advance towards socialism. So Marx argued that European colonialism, though it was exploitative, it was violent, it was something necessary for India. It was a welcome step, okay? Because it was a necessary in the progress of the world and its advance towards socialism. Because Marx argued that this transition from feudalism to capitalism is taking place only in Europe, and that will ultimately transform into a socialist and a communist society. So Europe has already done that, and the rest of the societies are lagging behind. They are not able to do that because this transformation from feudalism to capitalism has not happened. And Marx believed that this colonization, this process of colonization will herald that process. This process of colonization will push each and every society, each and every colonies into this process of capitalism, into the system of capitalism, which ultimately lead to that of socialism. So Marx was dreaming that kind of a situation. The oppressive Asiatic mode of production needs an external agent to overthrow it, which appeared with the European colonies. And this is an extremely important point. And for Marx, the political unity of India and its modern means of transport are the results of British actions. So, as I told you, Marx looked at India as a static society which did not have a history, which did not transform itself for a long time, which was so lethargic, which was so, he even uses the word vegetative state. He characterizes Indian state as a vegetative state in some of his other writings which I have not quoted here. So Marx recognizes that the British imperialism destroyed Indian culture, separating India from all its ancient traditions and from the whole of its past history. He recognizes that British imperialism destroyed Indian culture, separated India from all its ancient traditions and from the whole of its past history. And we don't exactly know what he means by Indian culture, whether what kind of position he had towards that, but this is an extremely important point for contemporary debate. What did British colonialism do to India? Of course, you know that they completely destroyed indigenous craft, indigenous industries. They looted India in the plain sense of the word. But there are also other arguments that a host of new ideas were brought to India through the process of colonialism. Indian society was never known for the whole celebration of idea of equality. Given a caste-bound society, ideas of justice, ideas of equality was never practiced. Or, in other words, there was religious legitimacy or cultural legitimacy to look at the different sections of Indians are unequal. So a host of institutions, including modern judiciary, modern legal system, ideas of rights, bureaucracy, and a host of ideas around this modern sense of emancipation, modern enlightenment ideas were brought in India through the process of colonialism. And that had a completely different impact on the traditionally underdeveloped, underprivileged sections of society. So a host of scholars who belong to the underprivileged sections of India, they would argue that colonialism was a positive issue. Because without colonial intervention, the lower castes would not have been able to come up in their life. They wouldn't have been able to enjoy the fruits of freedom. They wouldn't have been able to realize a kind of at least a token form of egalitarianism. So the debate is more complicated. I'm not going into that. So Marx writes that whatever may have been the crimes of England, she was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution. So in his early writings especially, and the scholars also argue that the kind of material the kind of data that Marx received from India were very limited. And this is very much reflected in Marxian writing only. Because was sitting in London. Marx has never visited India. For that matter, none of these people have visited India, but they have written extensively about it on the basis of very limited amount of material received, very biased kind of material received about India from India. So that must have really influenced their understanding about India. But he is very clear that whatever may have been the crimes of England, she has the unconscious tool of history in bringing about the revolution. At the same time, Marx criticizes European imperialists for their brutal treatment of native people, sometimes coming too close to advocating wars of national liberation against colonialism, especially in the case of Ireland. So Marx, while he understood this as a historic intervention, Marx was also extremely vehemently critical of the violent and exploitative nature of colonial enterprise. He never justified that, especially sitting in London. He was one of the most critical, most vocal critic of British imperialism, the way in which they looted wealth from Africa, from Asia, from India, and he never condoned that. Marx indicts British colonialism in India, stating that it was based on plunder and murder, as hideous as the slave trade. So this is also something important. While Marx, celebrated, or he celebrated the colonial intervention of India, he was also extremely critical of the brutality and exploitation associated with the colonial time, and he even equated it with slave trade, though the British did not engage in the kind of slavery in India that they have done with different countries. The British exploited the Indians both financially and physically. As Marx states, the British taxed India so that it crushed the mass of the Indian people to the dust, and its exaction necessitated a resort to such famines as torture. So Marx is very he's very vocal in his condemnation of the British exploitation, the British decimation of Indian craft and Indian culture, local industries, everything, and the kind of an exploitation that it inflicted on Indian society. He was extremely critical of British trade of opium in China and the exploitative trade relations with India. And you know the kind of British trade of opium in India, opium in China, and its devastating effect on the Chinese population, and the kind of absolutely immoral and unethical ways in which the British went ahead with the kind of opium trade, and also the kind of exploitation in India, taking away all the raw materials from India and making them into finished products, and then bringing them back and then selling at much higher prices, which prompted the Gandhiji to start this Swadeshi movement. So that he was quite conscious about that, the economic rationale of British colonialism. So Marx states that India had been the great workshop of cotton manufacturers since immemorial times, but that Britain demolished it in parts through imports. So Marx identifies the way in which the Britishers crushed the India's indigenous craft, indigenous industries, indigenous economy, and he writes about it. In such a context, expulsion of foreigners is just, Marx states. Dispassionate and thoughtful men may perhaps be led to ask whether people are not justified in attempting to expel foreign conquerors who have so abused their subjects. So he sometimes supports the kind of armed revolution against colonialism. Indians will not enjoy the fruits of their own labor until a socialist revolution occurs in Britain, or the Hindus themselves shall have grown strong enough to throw off the English yoke altogether. So it's very interesting that Marx sees the liberation of India through the liberation of British themselves. Marx believed that, or Marx wished that there is a working class revolution takes place in Europe, in Britain, and that would automatically lead to a similar revolution in India that would lift, or that would end the kind of colonial or imperial domination over India and the kind of resultant exploitation. Or the Hindus themselves shall have grown strong enough to throw off the English yoke altogether. So these are some of the observations, or some of the interesting snippets about Marxian position on democracy and on colonialism. because his positions have been always controversial, because they were not very simple. They were not very straight yes or no question. And in each of these positions, you will see how Marx was preoccupied. He was so preoccupied with a very Eurocentric understanding of history, very uncharitable view about other societies. His conviction, with his foolhardy conviction about the revolution as a social law, as the inevitability of a revolution, and it was not kind of nuanced enough to accept other possible course of human history. So these thoughts becomes more and more evident when you discuss Marxian analysis on colonialism, on democracy, and a host of other issues. Okay? So we will end the class, and we will have only one more session on Marx in the next class, where we will take a critical appraisal. We will try to have a broader appraisal of Karl Marx as a sociologist in the next class. So see you there. Thank you.